Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now I'm going to be really honest straight off the bat. The interesting part, which is the no highlight black that I promised, that is the first couple of minutes of the video, so don't feel as though you necessarily have to stick around for any surprises later on. I'm not going to be cheeky and force you to pad out my view time, but there are going to be some other interesting bits on the Commissar here if you're interested in painting something similar. Now the miniature that's whizzing around at the moment is actually the Cadian Castellan, and there's a very good reason for that. When they updated the Cadian range and replaced the Commissar, the new fella just doesn't do it for me. When I was a little fella, Commissars had sashes, big hats and red sashes, and that's how you knew where they were on the battlefield, whereas a new guy kind of looks like an unprepared cosplayer. But all the same, it's nice and simple to pick another miniature and make a Commissar that works for me. So all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description, same as always. Let's get started. So having established which is the slightly better looking miniature, I'm going to give you a second here to see if you can spot the conversion, because it was about 20 seconds worth of knife work and it's incredibly subtle, but I went ahead and did it anyway because I'm a fusspot. Can you see it? On the Castellan caps, there is a tiny wee stud just above the Aquila there, which has, I'm guessing it's a rank signifier or what have you, because the platoon leaders tend not to have something similar. So all I did was, with a sharp knife, trimmed it off and then scraped that down. The official Commissar miniature has a very slightly pointier hat, but for the purposes of what we're going to be doing, by the time we've painted it, he's going to look more iconic anyway, so I'm not too fussed about that. I just figured getting rid of that little stud will do the job to make him look a bit more Commissar. Now once he's all been assembled and that's been done, I've primed him with Mechanicus standard grey. And the grey that you're going to use doesn't matter too much as long as it's a medium grey. Gracier is going to be too light, so something like Mechanicus standard grey or uniform grey from the army painter will be perfect for this. Now ordinarily when you apply black Templar over something like white or Gracier, you get a fairly subtle off-black finish, but I want this Commissar's jacket to be darker. This is why we've used the grey primer. Now all the same, if we go ahead and apply a black contrast straight over the top of this, we're not going to get a lot of that highlighting and shading effect that contrast is ordinarily used for. So we've got to help a little bit here. What I've got is Ulthuan grey, and this is a smudger. It is a makeup brush, something nice and soft. And I'm going to work this into some paper towel. Now recently a bunch of folks have been telling me that I shouldn't be using paper towel for dry brushing, that there's these wonderful palettes or what have you. Honestly, in this instance, the texture that we will get is going to be preferable. I actually want what the paper towel is going to do for me here. So I'm going to lightly dry brush the edge of his base here to get a feel for what I'm going to leave behind off of the brush. And then let's start concentrating on areas where we want a highlight to appear once the contrast is finished drying. So concentrating by going against areas of detail. You see here with these sweeping folds in his coat, I'm angling my brush slightly and going with them to pick them up. And I'm going to do this over pretty much all of the miniature. I'm concentrating, of course, on the bits that are going to be black, but if we do happen to brighten up some of the areas, the other stuff as well, it won't matter because it'll actually help us paint those a little bit later on. Now, considering how much of the rest of the miniature you're going to end up doing that to, it's going to look really messy when you first do. But don't worry. What I've got next is some white scar and a much smaller brush. What I'm going to do here is concentrate on the smaller areas that I couldn't catch with the big brush, and just on more pronounced folds and creases. So this one here, along this section a couple of times, just brighten up some of those bits that are really going to catch the light. Now make sure to let that sit and settle and dry properly for a few minutes. Oftentimes, because we're dry brushing, the tendency is to assume as soon as the paint goes on, it's dry. But the medium still needs a couple of minutes or so just to settle and really stick to the miniature. So don't go straight for that contrast immediately that you finished the, the dry brushing. I'm going to use a medium shade brush for the lower half of the Commissar, and then I'm going to swap to a medium layer brush to do the upper parts of the miniature. What I have is black Templar, unsurprisingly, and I'm going to start applying this fairly generously over all of his coat. Now, as you apply this, try and keep your brush moving in the same direction, because it'll help the pull of the contrast by making sure that it settles down the bottom where it should. Obviously, in some areas, like up on his sleeves, that's going to be a little more difficult. And as you can also see, I'm not too fussed if I hit the stuff that we are going to paint later, same as with any other paint. And then a smaller brush to do his sleeves and all the other odd bits of black on his uniform. And once that's had time to thoroughly dry, you'll have something that looks like this. And isn't that the business? Honestly, the biggest tip I can give you is to make sure that when you are applying contrast, you're not just chucking it on and leaving it there. Really guide it where it needs to be. And like I said, keep your brush moving the same way. That will help a massive amount. What I'm going to do now is to base coat his skin. For this, I'm using tanned flesh from the Army Painter. You could use Bugman's Glow here, or whatever you fancy. I'm using this mostly because when I shade everything but the uniform, I want to be able to use one shade. And tanned flesh is just warm enough that if I shade it with something like Agrax Earthshade, it's not going to end up super dark. Now don't listen to me, because it turns out his hand actually has some texture on the back which implies it's a glove. So don't. Don't paint it like skin. Whoops. What I'm going to do next is start applying the red. And I have Mephiston Red for this. Where I'm going to put this one on is on the sash, because to my mind, Commissars have big red sashes. So straight over this, and you may find you need a couple of coats. So the bit that's hanging off of his waist, and also, carefully, the bit that's visible underneath his belt. So as you're painting this, try and draw your brush towards the belt in the center, because I don't want to hit the black if at all possible. If you do hit the black, we can still tidy it up, but obviously go slow, you'll find it a little easier. With the red applied, we're going to swap to Averland Sunset, and we're going to start painting in some of the yellow details, because if we do the trim now, it gives us a bit of license to be a little bit messy. And then these strips around his wrists and at the edge of his cuffs, we're doing essentially the same thing as we did with the red, where we can make mistakes quite happily towards where we are going to paint later and leave that black intact. And then for the tidy up, or rather the next stage, I have here Vorbak Red. Now you can use, like if you want a simpler color scheme, you could go back to Mephiston Red here, or you could even use Corn Red if that's what you've got. I just like the slight purple tint that Vorbak Red has without being as dominantly purple as something like a Baraknar Burgundy can be. Now I think we're starting to get somewhere. I think you can see where you could skip that step by using Mephiston Red instead, but I like the Vorbak Red. We're going to move on now to all of the metallic details. And there are quite a few of these, but I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel for all of them. So base coating his armor, his sword, plasma pistol, the works. This will take a little bit of time, and bits that are going to be gold, if you happen to be near them, you can just paint straight over the top with this silver now. Now, I'd suggest that's the bit that's probably going to take the longest. It is a slow step, and in some areas, particularly up on his shoulders and across his back, you are going to want to give this 2 coats to get a nice solid coverage. What I'm going to do now is lay down the leather, and for this I am actually using Leather Brown from Vallejo. Now, this is very, very similar to Dryad Bark, just a fraction lighter and maybe a little bit more warm. So if you want to stick to Citadel, Dryad Bark is an easy swap here. And now comes the next fiddly bit. For this I'm going to use Retributor armor and we're going to paint in the gold details. Now, don't worry too much here if you do end up splurging over, because again, most of what we're going to be painting is stuff that we can very easily tidy up as we go. Now, particularly if you went straight over these areas with the silver first, Retributor armor will cover very well. Now that's a little fiddly, but it is a lot of fun once it's done. I've got now Corax white, and I am going to apply this over the hand, or rather his glove, and I'm also going to put a couple of layers of it onto the plasma coils of his pistol here. You'll see I've also painted in the cable on his blade here, not because I want it to be white, but because I'm not 100% certain yet what I'm going to do with it. So white it is for now. But the opposite of that, I have got black, and this is the Vallejo black, simply because it covers much better than a Baden black does. There are a handful of details that I want to be very, very dark, solid black, and while ordinarily I tend not to use true black paint on things, as well this will also help to contrast with his jacket a little. So any bits that I want to be black, away we go, true black this time. And now we're almost finished applying our base coats. What I'm going to do now is dry brush just a little bit of Tyrant Skull deliberately over all of the base here. It's a nice off beige sort of color, which works really well for a dusty sort of finish over pretty much anything. So you could spend a bit of time getting in here with another color, painting in bricks and what have you, but the gray primer is pretty much perfect for just a bit of texture, and when we base the rest of these little bits later, this will be plenty. And now at last it's time to shade most of those details. What I'm going to use is actually a mix. This is half and half Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian medium. It's going to prevent everything from getting really dark, and the medium actually helps the shade to flow like the old mix did, so a bit happier with that. What I'm going to do is load up my medium shade brush. Now you can use a smaller brush if you fancy here, but as long as your shade brush keeps a point, you shouldn't have to worry too much about it. I'm going to apply this over everything except the black wherever possible. If I do end up getting a little bit on it as I come near to the edges of something, I'm not worried, but his armor, his skin, everything else is going to get a little bit of this Agrax mix. So let's cruise around, do that now, and then we'll give them about 20 minutes to dry and see what we end up with. Now, as I'm fond of pointing out, there's not much stopping you from putting them on the table like this, but we can take things a little bit further. So I'm going to start with some Cadian Fleshtone to do some highlights on his face, concentrating on his nose, cheekbones, pretty much everything except the recesses. So we want to really accentuate some of the shape of his face here. And then we'll add just a little bit of Kislev flesh across his nose, his chin, and his cheekbones. Just enough to add a bit more oomph to that face. And his ears. Now for the bright red details, I'm going to use here Wild Rider Red. And man oh man, when you see this go on, it is bright. So you want to be careful with it. And maybe a little more sparing than you might think. Just enough to accentuate some of the edges of detail on that Mephiston Red we started out with. So particularly on his sash here, you can use just the edge of your brush to catch that. And then for the bits of darker purple that we used, we'll highlight here with Wazdaka Red. Now this, likewise, don't want to use very much of this if you can avoid it. Then, with Golgfag Brown, we're going to highlight the leather. Now, if you want to highlight the leather even further, if you want a really cracked leathery effect, what I'd suggest is getting some Baneblade Brown and doing just the very corners. I'm not going to because I want his leather to look a little bit better looked after, but that's something that you can do. I've got some Ungor flesh, and this is what I'm going to use to highlight the yellow tassels and the little rim around his cap. Now onto the plasma coils on his pistol, I'm going to go ahead and add in a layer of Ethermatic Blue, which will look quite grimy over what we've done so far. And while that dries, I'm going to swap to Azurman Blue, and finally, I'm going to paint in this cable. I figure blue on both sides will balance the miniature nicely, even if it's not the same blue. Now, not to worry, we are going to come back to that plasma pistol, but first, while that dries, I have Liberator Gold, and we're going to, funnily enough, touch in just a few bits at the corners of any gold details that we want to really shine. And then to finish off the gold and silver together, what I have is steel. This is a Vallejo Model Air color. And man, oh man, this is bright. So let's get a spot here. So let's put just a tiny bit of that on the buckle there. And you'll see straight away how much of a difference it makes. So you don't want to add a huge amount of this. Just right at corners of gold as well to give it that proper ding effect. And then the very last thing I'm going to do before varnishing them is some tiny wee dots. You can see them whispering, you can hear them whispering rather, of white scar. Just little bits of this right up in the corners of these coils. Now once I'm finished with this, I'm going to varnish the whole miniature in a matte varnish. But then what I'm going to do is come back to this plasma coil, and I'll hit that with a little bit of hard coat so that it shines. The base I'll finish off as well, and I'll pop the extra bits I use for that in the description. Let's get a look at this fella once he is all finished. And so there at last, our Cadian style Castellan Commissar is complete. So if you've stuck around for the whole thing, thanks very much. Hi, it's nice to see you. And hopefully you did find some part of that interesting. I think there's a few colour choices in there which you might be able to take away to other miniatures, get some use out of. In particular, I really like Vorbak Red, so any excuse to sneak that onto a miniature suits me just fine. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much, folks, one and all. Now, if you've got any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.